Spider Man Remastered has been out on PS5 for a little while, and now that the PC version is about to be released, let's take a look at the photo mode and see, is it any good? My name is Mir, and let's get started, shall we? So before we even open up the photo mode, let's go into the settings and see what we can do visually. So settings, visual. So graphics mode, I have it set to performance RT, means that the game is going to be running at 60 frames per second, but I'll still get ray trace reflections. So everything's going to look a little bit nicer. Now if I go to fidelity, the ray trace reflections will improve in quality, but the game will get dropped down to 30 frames a second. Performance, ray tracing is gone altogether, and it's just 60 frames per second. So I want a good balance, so I'm going to stick with performance RT. So what I think I want to do, let's head to Times Square. Yeah, there we go. Alright, to access photo mode, go ahead and pause the game and go down to photo mode. So here you're going to be greeted with multiple options. So if you hit square, you can switch between your camera mode, lighting mode, and sticker mode. So let's go with the camera mode first. So on this first tab, the first setting you have is your camera type, and you have three of them. You have your free camera, your orbit camera, and your selfie camera. So the free one is you just move the camera around just however you want. Left analog stick to move around, right analog stick to rotate. Yeah, pretty self-explanatory. Orbit, you can use the left analog stick to move forwards and backwards, but you can't go left and right. Now if you do your right analog stick, Spider-Man's going to be right there in the middle of the frame, and you'll be orbiting around him. You'll be rotating around him. And your third option is going to be the selfie camera. Pretty self-explanatory. So after camera type, you have your suit, and really this is personal preference. I'm just going to stick with the default one, but just choose whichever one you enjoy. Next you have your tilt, and this just rotates the image. And if you wanted to, like let's say if we go down to 25, if you wanted to take more of a portrait or like a vertical image, you change your tilt. Then you have the ability to turn on and off Spider-Man, enemies, or the weather. I'm just going to leave all those on and hit R1 and move on to the lens. Now your lens tab is basically the meat and potatoes of a good photo mode. If you can adjust your lens, more than likely you can get a good shot out of it. So let's see what we can adjust. So the first thing is your FOV, or your field of view. So right now it's set to 100, which is basically saying that 100 is meaning wide. It's a 100-degree field of view. So you're seeing quite a bit in a wide angle. Now, if I move back and I drop the FOV, I'll start zooming in. Now, the smaller my FOV number is going to be, the smaller my field of vision is going to be. So that's exactly what's happening here. I'm zooming in essentially. Now on an actual camera, it won't be marked in degrees like your field of view. It's going to be marked in millimeters. And with millimeters, it's the opposite. The higher the millimeters, the more you're going to be zooming in. The lower the millimeters, the more you're going to be zooming out. So when you zoom in, this here is known as your telephoto. And when you zoom out, this is your wide angle. Of course, just like in everything else I mentioned, and I always mention this because you will see this on a real camera, your wide angle here, this introduces your wide angle distortion, where your foreground and your background are being distorted. They're being spread apart. Now, if I step back, if you're going to do telephoto, it's a good idea to physically step back. So in this case, I'll move the camera back and I'll zoom in. So this here is your telephoto, which means your foreground, which is Spider-Man, and your background, which is those buildings all the way at the end of the street, they're being compressed. They look like they're right next to each other. Once you start learning more about telephoto compression and wide angle distortion, and you see that you have the ability to change it in a game, it'll open up a bunch of different possibilities of what you can do with a photo mode. So like let's say if something was in the back, like let's say for example, let's take this screen back here. Because I'm using a telephoto lens right now, it looks like that screen back there is much larger and it's right behind Spider Man. Now if I zoom out, go into my wide angle, and I move my camera right next to Spider Man, now look, that screen is much farther away and it's much smaller compared to Spider Man. So once you start to notice these little things, your wide angle distortion and your telephoto compression, you can really play around with this in different photo modes. You can have a lot of fun with it. Now exposure, this is essentially your brightness. So increase the exposure and it's gonna brighten up the image. Decrease it, it's gonna darken your image. This is basically a standard affair. If you see the word exposure and you see it applied to something photography related, then that just means your brightness essentially. Now I think I'm gonna go on the ground for this. You know, one thing I did notice that I wish this game had is some sort of grid, some sort of lines that will help you compose your shot. So I have an overlay for that. This here is known as your rule of thirds. It's not a definite rule, you're allowed to break it, but basically this will help line up your shot. And this is something you're going to see on actual cameras, you're going to see it on your phone, you'll see this everywhere. So what I'm going to do, now let's put Spider-Man in the middle. So FOV, exposure, focus distance. So your focus distance is only going to work if your aperture has some sort of value in it. So right now it's at 0, it's not really doing anything. So if we increase this, it's going to bring out the blur. Blur in photography terms is known as bokeh. So now that we have some blur, we can move the focus distance. And as you can see, the focus distance, it's basically just setting like, okay, where do I want the focal point to end? So you set it at a low value and it's right in front of you. You set it at a higher value and it's going to be pushed back. So your aperture on an actual camera is known as f-stops. So if your lens is set to, let's say f1.8, f2, you're going to get this blurry background. If you set it to f11, f22, something like that, it's going to look more like this, where more is in focus. So in the case of this photo mode, your focus distance and your aperture applies to the background of whatever's happening back there. Your depth of field range near and your depth of field aperture near applies to everything to the foreground. So let's say if I change the range, let's say increase that, you'll see a line coming from the bottom of the screen. And this is basically changing your focal range at the bottom, at your foreground. You can see, like, if you look at Spider-Man's back, right now it's in focus, you increase this, and it starts to lose its focus. And now everything in front of Spider-Man is in focus, but he himself is not. Now your depth of field aperture, this is basically how blurry do you want it. Increase this, and you can really increase the blur. But that's kind of cool how you can separate both your foreground and your background focus. Can't really do that on a real camera. Usually it's limited by the lens itself and where your aperture is. So whatever f-stop you're at, that will basically just set your foreground and your background focal like range, and then your distance, you'll just change the focus and it'll just move that back and forth. Here you can actually adjust the foreground and the backgrounds completely separately. Can't really do it on a real camera, but hey, that's pretty cool that you can do it in here. Now, when you're still learning about editing, taking pictures, or any sort of creative thing where it's like moving a slider, audio production, anything like that, it's always fun to just mess with the slider and just go for it and see what happens. You just kind of learn that over time. So right now, that's what we're just going to do. We're just going to, I know what these things are doing, but I don't want the image to look perfect or great just yet. Let's just mess around with the settings. All right, so after the lens tab, we're going to move on, hit R1. And now you get your filters and frames. So your filter type, there's quite a few different filters in here, and they're pretty set. You can't adjust the colors individually in each single filter, but you do have quite a few to choose from. Yo, he's thick though. These are pretty cool. They're a bit overbearing at some moments. Oh my god, this reminds me of the Spider-Man 2 game I had on GameCube. So some of these are just a bit too much. But thankfully there's a blend slider here and you can actually adjust that. So if I wanted to, I can bring that down and just kind of adjust the level of the filter. For me personally, I usually just kind of go halfway. I think it looks the most pleasing. So next you have your frame selection, and in here there's actually quite a bit. I mean, they are very artistic frames. Oh yes, this is what I see in the real world. I always like these crop bars. They always look good on any game. It just makes that still look like a movie. And then once you have your frame set, then you have a frame level. So this basically means just where is the frame gonna sit? Is it gonna sit above the stickers or below the stickers? That's all it is. So your next tab is your overlays tab. Here you have a vignette. So intensity, it's not doing anything right now because I have to increase the size. And essentially a vignette is just going to be an oval that kind of closes in from the outside, and it just darkens up the edges. So the more I increase it, you'll see like from the outside going in, there's an oval coming in. How I would suggest you do a vignette is make it dark enough where your eye focuses more on the middle of the image, but don't make it too dark where the vignette itself is distracting. So it might take a few tries, might take some time to kind of get used to one, but maybe something like this. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good compared to no vignette like that. Now you have your film grain size and strength. Personally, I'm not a huge film grain fan. Really depends on the picture, really depends on like the look and feel. With Spider Man, I think more clean cut. So I would actually get rid of the film grain. But if you do like film grain, if you wanted to add that kind of vintage, kind of filmic feel to it, you can go ahead and increase it, and it's just going to add grain into your image. And then you can control the film grain with your strength slider. So you increase that and it's pretty noticeable. So if you look around his head, like next to his head, yeah, it's pretty grainy, pretty noisy. So next you have your sharpening slider. And honestly, this game is sharp as it is. The default setting for the photo mode, it's sharp as it is, but if you wanted to hurt your eyes, you can go ahead and increase the sharpness. And oh, that's painful. So yeah, the sharpening slider, I would say use that sparingly. Use it only if you absolutely need it. It doesn't make sense to go overboard with the sharpening. Again, subtlety is key when it comes to this kind of stuff. All right, your next tab is going to be your selfie settings. So let's go ahead and change the camera to a selfie camera. There we go. So in the selfie tab, first thing you can do is your emote. So you can go ahead and change the expression. Over time, you can change it to whichever one you like. I'm going to go ahead and, well, I was going to pick the default, but I'm going to pick the shifty one. I like this one. Oh, okay. This is just shifting which eye is doing the shifty emote. Okay, that's kind of neat. So it looks like each individual emote has its own setting when it comes to the eyes. That's actually kind of neat. I didn't know you could do that. All right, next you have a selfie light. So imagine some sort of light right in front of the phone, and it's just casting all this light, front facing. To me, this doesn't look that good. We're going to get to the lighting in just a second, and that is where I think you should use a light instead of the selfie light. But it's cool that it's in there. And of course, you can change the intensity. All right, hit square, and now you're in the light mode. Now here you can get pretty creative. So here you have two different types of lights. You have a sphere light and a spotlight. Let's start with a spotlight. So let's see, we're gonna hold R2 and we're gonna raise the spotlight. So R2, L2 to raise and lower, left and right on the analog stick to orbit around Spider Man, and then up and down on the left analog stick to move closer or away from Spider Man. So this is what I'm going to do. This spotlight. Oh, and then with the spotlight, your right analog stick, you can aim where you want it. So I kind of want it, if you've ever worked with a flash or a strobe, you'll probably be familiar with this. Instead of front facing, you'll have the light kind of at like a 45-degree angle to the person's face. So let's say something like that. I'm gonna move it back. So we're gonna aim something like that, right? And then once you have that set, you can change the intensity, which I'm gonna bring that down quite a bit. Cast shadows, I'm leaving this on. I'm not turning this off. I want a more realistic look. And if you take shadows out of things, it just creates such a dull looking image. So if you're working with light, definitely keep the shadows on. You can actually change the color of the light, which we'll get to in just a second, but I'll probably, let's see, we'll just cycle through it real quick. There's so many cool things you can do with the color, but I'm gonna leave it on red for now. So once you have your color set, you can actually change the intensity of it. So how saturated is the color, essentially. You can pick your color hue, essentially, and then your color intensity, which would be your saturation. All right, next you have your spread and softness, and this only applies to the spotlight. If I change it to sphere light, this option doesn't exist. So in spotlight, your spread, let's move this the spotlight closer and let's actually move it down. So your spread essentially is the cone. Like the shape of the cone, that's what's going to change. So if I bring this spread down, it's going to create this little funnel essentially. And you can choose like a very specific area, like where you want the light. So if you decrease the spread and then change this arrow where you want it, you can get a very, very specific spot when it comes to the light. Now the opposite direction, increase the spread, and it'll basically fan out the light. And then your softness, actually I would have to turn down this spread so you can see what softness is. Let's say we do this, right? Let's bring it on his face. So your softness is, if you've ever worked with Photoshop or any sort of like digital editing, softness is your feather. And what that means is basically where the light ends and where the light begins. Like how much of it is it going to smooth into each other. So if you have no softness whatsoever, it's just a hard light. You can see the transition. There is no transition between light and shadow, but increase the softness and it'll feather it out. So depending on the look you're going for, depending on the light that you're going for, your spread and softness on a spotlight is going to be absolutely essential. We're going to go down to distance. Right now it's at the maximum distance at 100. If we decrease this, what it's basically saying is, okay, this spotlight, how far the light is traveling, when you decrease the distance, it's decreasing how far the light is hitting the subject. If I start decreasing the distance on this spotlight, you'll notice that the light is starting to move backwards, back into the cone essentially. Fine-tune these settings mixed with the color intensity, color, shadow, and intensity, and you're going to get some excellent shots. Forget that selfie light one. This is what you're going to need to use. So Insomniac put this lighting mode in Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and I have a whole video explaining just this lighting mode in that video. So if you want to go ahead and check it out, I'll leave it up here, leave a link down. I mean, you know how YouTube works. Come on, you're smart. Now that we know the settings and how to change them, there's two different types of photography that I feel would be very beneficial with this photo mode. You have your portrait and you have your architecture / landscape. So let's try doing some portrait photography with Spider Man. The other thing I had in mind was your landscape and architecture photography. So if we go over here to Radio City Music Hall, a very iconic building in New York, let's say we stand here at the crosswalk, right? And let's say we're just a pedestrian, we want to take a picture. So of course, I've been through this whole thing and I feel horrible because I haven't gotten one of Spider Man swinging. So that is a must. Let's go ahead and start swinging around, see what we can get. All right, let's see what we can do here. So as usual, Insomniac Games always hits it out of the park with these photo modes. Spider Man Miles Morales, Spider Man Remastered, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Not only can you learn quite a bit of photography from these photo modes, it's also a lot of creative fun you can have with the stickers and filters and so on and so forth. There's so much to do in here. So I hope you learned quite a bit, and I hope I'm teaching you everything correctly. And yeah, that's going to be it for me today, and I'll see you guys next time.